Is ecstasy real, or is it bogus, or at least illusory to a large degree? Welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. In the last few episodes, you might remember we've been talking about existential ecstasy, how it seems to arise out of or accompany a sense of unity with ourselves and the world, and how this sense of unity in turn seems rooted in a kind of cognition that's different from abstractive thinking, a kind of immediate perception of reality. So it seems to people. But so far, we've been looking really just at these anecdotal and highly subjective accounts by real people and also by fictional people. But it's hard to know really what to make of this phenomenon based solely on these first-person accounts. People could be making them up, or maybe they're real phenomena, but people are misinterpreting their significance in some way. It's even possible, of course, that they're pathological states, like psychotic episodes or something. That's why it seems necessary to have not just these anecdotal accounts, but some kind of objective or universal, verifiable knowledge of them. So that's what we'll be looking at today. Like, what sense has modern science made of ecstasy? And I think one interesting thing about these experiences is that we in the modern West seem to have had a hard time knowing exactly what to make of them. For example, how to refer to them. I've used this word ecstasy, and this isn't uncommon, but there are other terms which more or less approximate what we're talking about here. Like there's this, we could call them mystical experiences, although this, of course, has associations with religion, and we've seen in at least the case of the Madeleine in Marcel Proust's novel that these experiences seem not to have to do with religion. That episode was narrated in essentially secular terms. We also have this term peak experiences that was coined in the early 60s by the psychologist Abraham Maslow. And then people also speak of unitive or unitative experiences. And then there's also a sort of more negative way, I guess, of describing these experiences as ego loss or ego death, even. So we also have a certain lack of clarity about how to categorize these experiences, how to classify them. There's this kind of fuzzy term, altered states of consciousness, but it really sort of covers a wide range of experiences. These kinds of ecstatic experiences we've talked about, plus hypnotic states or trance states, the effects of various kinds of drugs, meditation or mindfulness, dreaming, or even psychotic episodes, as I mentioned. That said, there does seem to be a certain commonality to me in all these experiences, because I do think it's true that to a greater or lesser extent, they involve some amount of suspension of this activity of abstraction and suspension, or at least lessening, of this subject-object divide. And there's still a few other terms for these experiences that I'll get into a bit later in this episode. I think the difficulty that we in the modern West have had with these experiences is partly because modern psychology is still kind of new as a science, but I think there's also this modern Western preoccupation since the Enlightenment with clarity, this goal expounded, for example, by René Descartes, that thinking should proceed using clear and distinct ideas. There seems to be this, we seem to put this requirement on ourselves, and it makes a lot of sense, I think, that our thinking should be sort of yes, no, it is or it isn't. But consciousness can seem to have this sort of nebulous quality that makes it kind of hard to get at with this kind of thinking. And I think related to this is the close association these experiences have had with religion, because I think it's fair to say that religion is often found itself at odds with and eroded by this Enlightenment culture of clear and distinct ideas. I think this association with religion has tended to make people who are skeptical of religion likewise skeptical of these experiences, probably. Anyway, I think all of these factors kind of coalesce in a fascinating way in a discussion of unitive experiences. That's not the term he uses, by Sigmund Freud, actually, in the early 20s, a few years after Proust actually had written about his Madeleine experience. And actually, in fact, as Knud Rasmussen was dog sledding across the Canadian Arctic talking to shamans, a French writer and mystic by the name of Romain Rolland began striking up a correspondence with Freud about a similar experience, which he called oceanic. Freud writes about this correspondence and about what Rolland had told him about it in the opening chapter of his Civilization and Discontents, which came out in 1929. Excuse me. I actually think Freud's discussion of this topic is quite fascinating and kind of profound, really. And so I'm going to be honest here, I find it hard to resist reading the text to you at some length, and I hope you'll bear with me. Don't forget that YouTube shows me when viewership is dropping off, so I'm watching you. So here's how the text begins. Freud starts talking about this correspondence with Romain Rolland. I'd sent him my small book that treats religion as an illusion, and that book was, of course, The Future of an Illusion, Freud's polemic against religion. And he answered that he entirely agreed with my judgment upon religion, but that he was sorry I had not properly appreciated the true source of religious sentiments. This, he says, consists in a peculiar feeling, which he himself is never without. When I read that, I thought, well, he must be kind of exaggerating here, but that's okay. Which he finds confirmed by many others, and which he may suppose is present in millions of people. It's a feeling which he would like to call a sensation of eternity, and these quotation marks are Freud's. A feeling as of something limitless, unbounded, as it were, oceanic. This feeling, he adds, is a purely subjective fact, not an article of faith. It brings with it no assurance of personal immortality, but it is the source, according to Rolland, of the religious energy which is seized upon by the various churches and religious systems, directed by them into particular channels, and doubtless also exhausted by them. One may, he thinks, rightly call oneself religious on the ground of this oceanic feeling alone, even if one rejects every belief and every illusion. Paging Richard Dawkins. And that actually makes you think of the spiritual but not religious identity, or it made me think of the spiritual but not religious identity that some people have today, almost seeing Romain Rolland as a sort of forerunner of that, perhaps. But anyway, Freud then writes about the nebulous character of these experiences. He thinks it makes it hard to know what to make of them. He writes that the only way he feels able to do this is if he tries to find a concept of some kind, so that he's not just talking about pure feeling, which he says he finds basically impossible to talk about. And he in fact does find a concept. He claims to find a concept in them. He writes, I cannot discover this oceanic feeling in myself. It's not easy to deal scientifically with feelings. One can attempt to describe the physiological signs. Where this is not possible, and I am afraid that the oceanic feeling too will defy this kind of characterization, nothing remains but to fall back on the ideational content, which is most readily associated with the feeling. If I have understood my friend rightly, it is a feeling of an indissoluble bond, of being one with the external world as a whole. I may remark that to me this seems something rather in the nature of an intellectual perception. So he's saying it really seems more like a judgment than a feeling. He then seems to suggest that there are natural causes for this perception of oneness, since it crops up in other contexts, in erotic and psychotic episodes, for example. He writes, "The idea of men's receiving an intimation of their connection with the world around them through an immediate feeling, which is from the outset directed to that purpose, seems so strange and fits in so badly with the fabric of our psychology that one is justified in attempting to discover a psychoanalytic explanation of such a feeling." There's a sense he wants to he senses the presence of hocus pocus that he wants to sort of get behind and find something that he would consider substantive in the form of a natural origin that could be analyzed. The following line of thought suggests itself. Normally, there's nothing of which we are more certain than the feeling of ourself, of our own ego. This ego appears to us as something autonomous and unitary, marked off distinctly from everything else. There's only one state, admittedly an unusual state, but not one that can be stigmatized as pathological, in which it does not do this. At the height of being in love, the boundary between ego and object threatens to melt away. Against all the evidence of his senses, a man who is in love declares that I and you are one, and is prepared to behave as if it were a fact. And I think other genders also. What can be temporarily done away with by a physiological or normal, it says in square brackets, function must also, of course, be liable to be disturbed by pathological processes. I think he's talking about psychosis here. Pathology has made us acquainted with a great number of states in which the boundary lines between the ego and the external world become uncertain, or in which they're actually drawn incorrectly. There are cases in which parts of a person's own body, even portions of his own mental life, his perceptions, thoughts, and feelings appear alien to him and as not belonging to his ego. There are other cases in which he ascribes to the external world things that clearly originate in his own ego and that ought to be acknowledged by it. Thus, even the feeling of our own ego is subject to disturbances, and the boundaries of the ego are not constant. Perhaps he's not talking only about psychosis, but extreme states of psychic life in general, if you want to call it that. Anyway, he now arrives at his own theory of what's most likely behind these experiences, this oceanic feeling, that they're a kind of memory, actually, of our earliest infancy, before our egos had developed. He writes, "Further reflection tells us that the adult's ego feeling cannot have been the same from the beginning. It must have gone through a process of development, which cannot, of course, be demonstrated, but which admits of being constructed with a fair degree of probability. An infant at the breast does not as yet distinguish his ego from the external world as the source of the sensations flowing in upon him. He gradually learns to do so in response to various promptings. He must be very strongly impressed by the fact that some sources of excitation, which he will later recognize as his own bodily organs, can provide him with sensations at any moment, whereas other sources evade him from time to time, among them what he desires most of all, his mother's breast, and only reappear as a result of his screaming for help. In this way, there is, for the first time, set over against the ego, an object in the form of something which exists outside and which is only forced to appear by a special action." To me, it seems there's something Freud isn't saying here, and I think it's quite important. And it's that these repeated actions plus a child's natural capacity for thinking leads the child to abstractive thinking. The natural capacity plus the fact of this repetition allows the child to start forming concepts and making predictions about what will happen. And I think that's an essential ingredient to the subject-object relationship with the world, and a relationship that's not just immediate. But of course, I do think it seems hard to deny that this is something that must come about in us as very young children. Anyway, he goes on to speculate that the memory of this egoless state remains with us as we grow out of early childhood, with some more than others. In this way, then, he writes, the ego detaches itself from the external world. Or to put it more correctly, originally the ego includes everything. Later it separates off an external world from itself. Our present ego feeling is therefore only a shrunken residue of a much more inclusive, indeed all-embracing feeling, which corresponded to a more intimate bond between the ego and the world about it. If we may assume that there are many people in whose mental life this primary ego feeling has persisted to a greater or less degree, it would exist in them side by side with the narrower and more sharply demarcated ego feeling of maturity, like a kind of counterpart to it. So it's a mental state that you kind of lapse into occasionally. In that case, the ideational contents appropriate to it would be precisely those of limitless and of a bond with the universe. The same ideas with which my friend elucidated the oceanic feeling. So he then goes on a bit of a digression, and then he goes back to this question of whether this oceanic feeling is indeed at the heart of religion. To me, the claim does not seem compelling, he writes. And then he goes on to talk about how he himself sees the origin of religion primarily in the infant's longing for the protection of a powerful father. And he speculates that the oceanic feeling may play some role in this, before once more complaining about the difficulty of investigating these states. And he uses as an example of this a state of consciousness supposedly attained by another friend, actually, who had taken up yoga, which must have been quite new in the West at the time. But apparently there were yoga practitioners in Vienna in the 20s. He writes, the origin of the religious attitude can be traced back in clear outlines as far as the feeling of infantile helplessness. There may be something further behind that, but for the present it's wrapped in obscurity. I can imagine that the oceanic feeling became connected with religion later on. The oneness with the universe, which constitutes its ideational content, sounds like a first attempt at a religious consolation, as though it were another way of disclaiming the danger which the ego recognizes as threatening it from the external world. So it's kind of a reflex that we instinctively use to calm ourselves, according to Freud's speculation here. Let me admit once more that it's very difficult for me to work with these almost intangible qualities. Another friend of mine whose insatiable craving for knowledge has led him to make the most unusual experiments and has ended by giving him encyclopedic knowledge, has assured me that through the practices of yoga, by withdrawing from the world, by fixing the attention on bodily functions, and by peculiar methods of breathing, one can in fact evoke new sensations and koinesthesias in oneself. And so here apparently is another term for a unitative or unitive state, this word koinesthesia, which I and possibly many of you may have to look up in a dictionary, or maybe you won't after this video. Anyway, I looked it up. The definition I found was the general feeling of bodily existence arising from the sum of bodily sensations as distinct from the particular sensations themselves, the vital sense. So it sounds like a feeling of being in a body, but having the mind not really focused on any particular perception. And I think it goes without saying, without being focused on any particular thought. So maybe an immediate sense of being in one's body. So anyway, he writes that he believes this friend found in yoga new sensations Oh, and I meant to say, sorry, it comes from the Greek koinos, which is common, and eistasis, which is feeling, which is where aesthetic comes from. It can evoke new sensations and koinesthesias in oneself, which he regards as regressions to primordial states of mind, which have long been overlaid. But yeah, Freud is skeptical of this, and he ends the first chapter of his work, Civilization and Its Discontents, by suggesting he's a bit skeptical of this, and he does so by quoting the German poet Schiller's poem about a diver, and in a way that seems to suggest a desire for greater clarity than these experiences can afford. So Freud writes, his friend sees in them, these yoga-based koinesthesias, a physiological basis, as it were, of much of the wisdom of mysticism. It would not be hard to find connections here with a number of obscure modifications of mental life, such as trances and ecstasies. But I am moved to exclaim, in the words of Schiller's diver, and most the editions seem to have the original German here, Es freue sich, wer da atmet im rosigten Licht. Let him rejoice who breathes up here in the roseate light, and doesn't dwell too much on these obscure states of consciousness. And that's how the first chapter ends. I think one of the things that's really fascinating about this chapter, actually, is that while Freud, on the one hand, seems impatient and dismissive of these states, he nevertheless manages to mine this sort of fascinating theories out of them. And, well, I guess really I'm talking in particular, of course, about this notion of explaining the oceanic feeling, or ecstasy, you could say, solely in terms of the memory of being at the breast when there's this sense of absolute oneness. You can imagine the infant would have no other awareness than this warm, nourishing milk entering their body and the intimacy with the mother. And you can imagine a suspension of this sort of subject-object state. And I think that's fascinating. I think on the one hand, there seems to be, to me, something reductionist about it. I don't know if it really offers a satisfactory explanation of why these states, if this is just a memory, why do people report from these states a sense of hope, and also often, and we'll get into this later, an ability to help them make decisions? Yeah, I think there's something he's onto here, but I think we will get back to this later. But I also really kind of marvel at the way he's used this feeling as a springboard for a discussion of how these unitative states. He brings both skepticism to them, but he also argues, he seems to be arguing that they're also natural to humanity. And how there's this side by side with this everyday subject-object relationship we have with the world that we sort of tend to think of just as sort of normal human living. We also seem to simultaneously dwell in this other world of immediacy. As he says, the feeling of our own ego is subject to disturbances, and the boundaries of the ego are not constant. I think it is a statement of huge importance to human consciousness and human happiness, actually. Anyway, his speculations about these states, of course, are just the tip of the iceberg. And in the next few episodes, I'd like to get into our modern fascination over these last couple hundred years or so with these unitive experiences and what scientific research seems to be saying about them. In particular, it seems to be pointing to the conclusion that they're natural elements of human life. And I think increasingly that we may have a natural desire to experience them. And as my argument will lead later, I think we do, and I think we ignore this natural desire at our peril. Anyway, thanks for joining me again today, and hope to see you next time.